evening, and thank you for joining us at tonight's Live from the Library program presented by the Walnut Creek Library Foundation. My name is Kathleen Odney, and I'm on the board of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and we'd like to really warmly welcome you to our program and thank you to our premier sponsor for tonight's event, Merrill Lynch, as well as our other live program sponsors, the East Bay Times and Minuteman Press in Lafayette. Tonight we are so excited. We have celebrated author Elise Hooper discuss her book, Learning to See, a novel of Dorothea Lange, the woman who revealed the real America. I hope you had a chance to see the lovely photos as you came in, and there'll be others in the presentation tonight. Many are familiar with Dorothea Lange's influential photographs, which have been displayed at places ranging from MoMA to prestigious art galleries throughout the country. Far fewer know the story of how Dorothea Nutzhorn became Dorothea Lange, an unsung feminist hero and first female recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1940. Dorothea Lange is famous as the pioneering documentary photographer who captured iconic images of the Great Depression and the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. But lesser known, Dorothea Lange has strong ties to the Bay Area. In 1918, as a fearless 22-year-old from the Northeast, she arrived in bohemian San Francisco, where she soon became a prestigious portrait photographer and wife of talented yet volatile painter Maynard Dixon. By the early 30s, amid personal and economic upheaval, she took to the road with her camera, determined to expose the horrific conditions of the nation's poor. In so doing, she created images that would inspire, reform, and define an era. Learning to See was released just January 22nd, and Ms. Hooper appears tonight as part of her book launch tour of the San Francisco Bay Area. Ms. Hooper is also the author of The Other Alcott, a work of historical fiction about art, ambition, and the real women behind the March Sisters of Alcott's beloved classic, Little Women. Copies of Learning to See will be available for sale after Ms. Hooper's remarks, and she will be signing those books as well. So if you're interested, we would love to see you purchase a book. And also, please remember to sign up for next month's Live from the Library program, an entirely different subject, Adventures in Produce, the rewards of growing and cooking weird fruit and veggies, where we'll feature a lively discussion with Emily Murphy and Laura McLively. Now please join me in welcoming Elise Hooper.
Wow, thank you all so much. Coming out on, and I had to think about this, but it's Wednesday night. I'm never really sure at this point of where I am in my book tour. Coming out to the library, you know, I have a bit of a confession that sometimes I judge people by their bookshelves. And I always am able to sort of judge a community by their library system. And wow, Walnut Creek, I am impressed. This is an amazing turnout you've got tonight. And a beautiful library. You're very lucky to have such a great facility in your community. So I'm here tonight, as was said, to talk about Dorothea Lange and my novel, Learning to See. It's a novel, which means it's fiction, which means it's, you know, based on real life, but nevertheless, I used my imagination to craft a story. And I'm often asked, really, what is biographical fiction? What is it? How much am I true to the real story? And so the best example I can come up with here is a little fellow you may have heard of named Hamilton. On the one hand, you have Ron Chernow's Cradle to Grave biography. How many of you have read it in here? It's great, it's long, it covers everything, right? The footnotes alone are fascinating, or the endnotes. And then, and this was a highlight of my year last year, was going to see Hamilton. You're in luck. I don't dance or sing. I wish I could. But then you have Lin-Manuel Miranda, who read the Cradle to Grave biography and was fascinated and saw the potential for a real story. He made some changes. There's a love triangle that really probably didn't so much exist in real life. But he made it a compelling story. that was meant to be accessible to people, that people were meant to come and enjoy. And what I always say about my books is the best compliment I can get from a reader is like, wow, I loved your book and I learned a lot. I love tricking people into learning things. It's what I live for. And so I really think, you know, again, I'm not a performer who can get up there and dance and sing, but probably my work lies more in the entertainment realm than this long cradle to grave work. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about Dorothea Lange and how I landed on writing about her. We all know this photo, Migrant Mother. Yes, everyone's head is nodding. It has been on postage stamps. Memes have been made from it. It is one of probably the most iconic images in American history. And yet, very little is known about the woman who created it. And I have a history as a high school teacher. I taught literature and history for many years. And I would use Lange's photographs in my classes when teaching The Grapes of Wrath or teaching the Great Depression. And I was always fascinated by this woman's work, but I really knew nothing about her. And then I went to, my first book, The Other Alcott, came out. And when I was writing that, I went back to Concord, Massachusetts a bunch of times to work on that novel. I'm from that area, so it was a bit of returning home. But nevertheless, I live in Seattle now and have 2 young children of my own. And traveling across the country was a big endeavor, multiple times. And so I knew for my second book, I wanted to do something that was more local to me. And I started off very interested in a woman named Imogen Cunningham. I see some nodding heads. Excellent. Okay, so she ends up here in the Bay Area, but really her roots are in the Pacific Northwest, where I live now. She was born in Portland, and she went to the University of Washington. And she was a woman who brought great passion and a fascinating eye to this burgeoning field of kind of artistic photography. And so she was a great figure for me, and I was intrigued. And she did quirky things like she actually photographed her husband naked, which in the early 1900s was considered pretty scandalous. A naked man was, a naked woman was, we'd seen them in paintings, but a naked man drew attention. And that was an exhibit she actually did in Pioneer Square in Seattle. And she was immediately sort of a scandalous woman because of this. And so there were things I really liked about Imogen, and so I delved into her life, and what I found was that I needed to broaden my scope, like you do in researching anyone, and kind of understand their circle of friends and their influences. And lo and behold, in 1918, this young woman arrived in San Francisco, which is where Imogen was living at that point with her family, and they became good friends, and this was Dorothea Lange. And as I started then learning about Dorothea in the context of Imogen, I found myself very pulled to Dorothea's story. She was definitely a fascinating figure. For one thing, in 1918, she arrived here from the Northeast on a trip around the world with her best friend. 1918. A 22-year-old woman was on a trip around the world. Still when kids announce they're on a trip around the world, eyebrows are raised, especially by their parents. And yet this was, 100 years ago. And so right then and there, this woman, Dorothea, intrigued me. And yet, as I said, I knew of this work she had done in the 30s. And so it was not quite squaring up, this kind of young firecracker who arrived in San Francisco and very quickly set about creating this very successful photography studio. I wanted to figure out who was this woman. And so I found myself kind of pulling away from Imogen and focusing on Dorothea a bit more. Now so it's gonna be your left. I still have to think about my right and left a lot. We can see some early photos of Dorothea's from this portrait studio she did. She took portraits of really San Francisco's well-heeled society. If you were a member of a certain social class, you wanted to go have your portrait taken by this young woman who brought a really modern sensibility. She didn't drape people up in fancy clothes. She actually wanted people to kind of just stare into the middle distance, look kind of dreamy, There was not a lot of staging. And so Dorothea became kind of this modern woman who everyone was intrigued by. And yet then how do we figure out this portrait on the other side that she did at Manzanar in 1942? I mean, clearly a big leap was made in her work. And this transformation fascinated me because not all of Dorothea's artistic peers were making this leap. Many of them stayed with their images that would be considered kind of fine art photography for really all of their careers. And so I wanted to understand, what was it about Dorothea that made her drawn to things that so many other people were ready to look away from? And so typically what happens when I find someone who is so interesting like this, and I'm going to write a novel about them, something I need to do is figure out I call them kind of ghosts. What are the ghosts that have existed in people's past, sort of formative experiences that we all carry along into the rest of our lives that shaped Dorothea and gave rise to this pivot we see in her work? I have two photos here. The one on the far side is Dorothea with her younger brother, Martin, taken in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is where she grew up. And then this one is probably about the age at which she arrived in San Francisco during her 20s. But so Dorothea had two, as I can see it, she had two very pivotal experiences in her young life that really shaped much of her later life and work. The first was at the age of 7, she contracted polio. And she spent a couple feverish weeks battling this illness. And when she came out of it, she seemed fine at first, although she ended up with a leg that was paralyzed. And she was able to get some movement back, but nevertheless, it left her with a leg that permanently made her limp for the rest of her life. And I really thought a lot about this and how this impacted her. And I think it really gave her a real sense of empathy to people who were maybe a little bit different. And certainly that would explain much of the work we see later in her life. The other thing I think it did for her was I think she carried a certain burden of feeling always like she was a bit defective. And her family initially, their accounts had sort of coached her on ways to hide it. Her mother in particular really didn't want people to look at Dorothea and sort of think about contagion or anything like that. So I think Dorothea from a very early age got the impression that something was wrong with her and she needed to cover it up. And the other thing that happened to her that I think is really important to understand is that her father left her at the age of 12. He one afternoon just vanished and she never saw him again. She never knew what became of her father. Later, a biographer would determine that he left because he had some legal entanglements and some debt that made him kind of vanish truly overnight. Interestingly enough, though, Dorothea's mother remained in touch with him for about another decade. She never told her children she was still in touch with him. She never told them that she maintained a relationship with them. And I think a lot of this was because she needed to divorce him for her own ability to kind of move on with her life, especially in the realm of debt. And the way law worked at the time, she needed to essentially show that she had been abandoned. And so clearly she took this so literally, she never even told her children what had become of her father, what had become of their father. And I think for Dorothea especially, she really worried about this. She felt in some ways that she was unlovable. And I think this connects back to the polio too, of what was wrong with her that made her father walk out one day and never come back. She carried real psychic wounds, I think, from both of these things. That I think then we can look at, they shaped her interest in people who struggled fitting in, people who maybe were struggling finding the American dream, and people who were a little different and stuck out from mainstream society. Dorothea was interested in these people. And actually there are accounts of, in later years, when she would walk amongst the fields or down San Francisco sidewalks, she had what was sort of called sometimes like an invisibility cloak, where she could kind of walk fairly unnoticed. Or she could walk up to people and very quickly and easily talk to them and get them to agree that she could photograph them. And I think this all came from these kind of things of feeling like she was a bit of an outsider too. She was looking for a way to fit in. And I think people recognized that in her. People saw her empathetic nature, I think. And so these two things really shaped much of the story that then I was going to focus on, which is really the years of her arrival in San Francisco in 1918 to her work in early World War II. Those couple of decades are what I wanted to focus on. And so I'm going to tie us a little bit back to some photos that she's taken that are very well known, a few of my favorites, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation and we can take some questions too from the audience. So here's Migrant Mother again with the postage stamp. One thing I want to draw your attention to though is the wider shot that is much less, is not as frequently seen as the tight shot of Dorothea with the children pulled up to her shoulder. I want you to look at that wide shot and really, truly what a grim picture that is. The tent, there is garbage littering the field around them. I've always found it fascinating that the picture we know as Migrant Mother actually has really been sanitized over time. I mean, it's really been cleaned up to make it pretty palatable enough to be on a postage stamp. So that's one thing I always draw people's attention to, how different it looks in this bigger image. This next one I actually reference a bit in the novel. And much of her work is in the public domain. So in the back of Learning to See, my novel, we were able to use a lot of photos that are in the public domain, photos that she took that are currently at the Library of Congress. However, this one on the right isn't in the Library of Congress. So I couldn't really show what was happening here in my afterward pictures at the end of the book. But Dorothea did a series throughout the American South of these gas stations that she was kind of fascinated by. She thought they showed much of kind of the backward attitudes that she felt very pervasive in the South at that point. Poverty, these places tended to be very ramshackle, and they tended to be filled with men kind of loafing about with nowhere else to go. Obviously, a high rate of unemployment at this time too factored into this. There was also a certain amount of racial tension that fascinated her. And you can see in the far photo there is an African-American man sort of sitting there on the fringe. She felt always looking a bit tense. She always felt that these gatherings that kind of existed at every gas station she visited showed a bit of potential for violence and fear. And so she took, as I said, a bunch of these. The lower one on the right there, again, yeah, right, is another one of the same gas station. But I want you to look at how the government eventually cleaned this up and turned it into a poster that was really on display at the end of World War II, where it says, where a fellow can start on the home team and wind up in the big leagues. You know, this is America up at the top. Where a fellow can start on the home team and wind up in the big league, where there is always room at the top for the fellow who has it on the ball. This is your America. Keep it free. You know, that's not at all what Dorothea was trying to show with these images at all, right? But I think it's pretty fascinating how these images have really changed over time, and especially in the hands of sort of the government, the media. She had a lot of images, especially of African Americans, that she wanted newspapers to pick up at the time, and they wouldn't go near them. So Dorothea had a pretty subversive nature quite early on, which I just found very fascinating for her times. Okay. Oh, that's the end of my show. I thought there were a couple more slides, but that's okay. So I think then we'll change it over to our conversation now, and we can talk about some of the aspects of the book, and again, fiction meets reality.
So I had the wonderful privilege of reading the book, and I found it fascinating that a woman who is best known for taking iconic pictures of women and children had such a conflicted family life herself.
Right.
And can you share that part of her and some of the difficult decisions she had to make?
Well, also this was a big part about what made Dorothea really interesting to me. I think she really represents this fascinating time capsule of what women's lives were like in the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s, even beyond. Because she was a woman who literally itched to make an impact, to have a greater influence over. She was a real New Dealer. She believed in the power of government to help people. And so all of this was driving her ambitions to create work that felt important. That was really significant to Dorothea. She wanted to feel like all of her work was meaningful. And yet, we got to think about the times here. What was it like for an ambitious woman to try to create work outside of a home? Here's the hint. It wasn't easy. Dorothea, there weren't daycares. There are many more options for many women, not all women, certainly today. But Dorothea had very few options at that time. I want to remind you that she had left her family in the Northeast to settle in California. So eventually, as she has a family of her own with Maynard Dixon, her first husband, as the stock market crashes and the Great Depression sets in, Maynard's work dried up pretty instantaneously. People were not buying fine art at this point. But Dorothea had the potential to still support her family through work she received from the government. Government agencies hired her to document the conditions of American workers, American laborers throughout the country. But again, they have 2 young children. What was Dorothea going to do with her children? She lived far from family. Daycare, things like that weren't readily available. Interestingly enough, what never really came up as an option was Maynard. So Dorothea was forced to make some very challenging decisions that I think can often be pretty startling to modern readers today, of the lengths that a woman had to go to find care for her family in these challenging times. I think especially, we were kind of talking at dinner about how people today, it's so easy to forget about the really tough times of the 1930s. I was talking about how my grandmother was orphaned during that era and was really kind of shuttled around to relatives for really the rest of her girlhood. And she always carried those psychic wounds with her of feeling kind of abandoned and unloved. And I think there was just a different sense of family then. People were doing what they needed to survive. This whole idea, we were sort of joking that parenting is sort of a modern idea. At some point, people were just trying to make it through every day, put bread on their tables for their families. And so Dorothea had some challenging times ahead of her to juggle this work, and not even juggle it, but just figure out how she was going to make it through her days. So that presented me with a really fascinating tension. Her work, there was a tension in her professional life of trying to get ahead as a woman during a time when she was really the only photographer on staff for the government for quite a long time. And then this tension that existed within her personal life of trying to meet the needs of her family. I was saying at dinner that not many people's lives are novel ready. In fact, you do not want your life to be ready to be in a novel. That means you have challenging times, great deal of tension. Dorothea's life was novel ready. She had all kinds of issues that I really had to simplify in many cases. Because she had, her extended family was having its own challenges. So in many ways, I really had to focus on this emotional transformation, her emotional journey she goes on to really create that woman who emerges from the 1920s of San Francisco's sort of popular portrait photographer into a real activist for social justice.
So speaking of Maynard,
yes,
she had a complicated relationship with Maynard Dixon, her first husband, who was immensely talented but very volatile. And at the end of their marriage, Maynard actually asks Dorothea if he thinks their marriage would have survived if it had not been for the Great Depression. So what are your thoughts about Maynard in this very complicated relationship?
Yeah, I love how complicated has become this euphemism for so many things. I think we have Facebook to thank for that, with status updates. Maynard was a great character in many ways. I'm not giving a big spoiler here when I describe a little bit how they meet, which is he appears in Dorothea's studio one day, and the outfit is insane. He was a real romantic about the American West, loved this idea of swooping vistas with mesas and Native Americans, although he would never have used that because that would have been way too PC for him. But he wanted to believe in this sort of old-timey American West. So when he arrived in Dorothea's studio for the first time to introduce himself, he showed up wearing black cowboy boots. I think they may have had spurs on them, a black cowboy hat. He carried a sort of a cane with like a silver kind of sculpture at the end, and he wore a black cape. So he was almost like a Superman cowboy thing. Very unique. He was a very colorful character, which from a novelist's point of view makes for a fun character to write. I mean, he had a real colorful way of speaking, lots of folksy terms that I would read in lots of interviews with people who knew him, and even in his own sort of poetry he would write. He was great fun to write, but he was a lousy husband. And so he was a compelling figure to drive along. And I think Dorothea was pretty smitten with him. I mean, when they met, she was about 20 years younger than him, which I also think maybe ties back to the father leaving. I'm not a big psychologist, but I think there's something there. And so would their marriage have survived had times remained the sort of the roaring 20s? I don't know. I mean, who's to know? But I do think that Dorothea had ambitions beyond sort of being a portrait photographer for the rest of her life. And Maynard had really no interest in those ambitions. And so it's really when events conspire to kind of reduce Maynard's work and in some ways increase Dorothea's options that Dorothea's life really changes dramatically. And suddenly she was off to the races, really creating work that filled a real passion for her. I don't know if their marriage would have survived. I think in some ways they wanted it to. I mean, they fought hard for that. Dorothea had seen firsthand what it was like to be in a family without a dad. So she really worked hard to make that work. But in the end, it did not work.
So people who worked with her and who knew her well often describe her as difficult and controlling. Do you think it's a fair characterization?
Yes, but in a really good way. I really wanted the title for this to be A Difficult Woman. In a good way. I mean, I think she had to be difficult to get what she wanted and needed. She really had to fight for a lot of things, especially with her job for the government. And even still, she was paid much less than the other male photographers she was working with. She was out on the West Coast when most of these other photographers were all based in Washington, D.C. So there was rampant opportunity for miscommunication with her boss. I mean, she had to really advocate for herself. She is a great example of a woman who did not suffer fools. And again, that is what made her so interesting. And in many ways, a woman who is very ahead of her time, I think.
So she had some incredible relationships. Her circle of friends was unbelievable. Imogen Cunningham,
yes.
Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, Ansel Adams. She moved in some rarefied circles.
Right.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the culture of the artistic community in San Francisco at that time, and some ways that they were dismissive of her because of some choices she made.
Right. Well, again, imagine that Dorothea, she's arrived in San Francisco. She has set up this very successful photography studio, portraits for wealthy people. I think the term today would be that maybe she was considered a sellout by her peers because she was making money, whereas many of her peers were not. And so a lot of her friends went on to create these kind of avant-garde, these groups where they were producing work that was potentially not commercial at all in nature. But Dorothea knew. She had watched her single mother have to get a career and support herself. She was very interested in making money. And so Dorothea had to kind of march to the beat of her own drummer in many ways and try to remain confident in a circle that valued kind of being artistic and being different and creating things that were beautiful. Dorothea was a bit of a pragmatist. She wanted to see beauty met with function, which is why using the camera to open people's eyes to things they didn't want to think about really appealed to her in a way that it really never resonated with her peers. In fact, sometimes I have a slide in which I'm able to show some of Ansel Adams' photography at Manzanar contrasted with Dorothea's. And there's a big difference. Dorothea was always looking to kind of emphasize the subversive nature of what she was, of the injustice she was seeing. So for example, she would look for shadows to fall and look like bars on these people who were in Manzanar. Ansel Adams, when he arrived at Manzanar, he took photos of the sky with the awful barracks people were living in. We're just sort of at the bottom of the frame. He took beautiful pictures of the terrain or pictures of people and the pride on their faces. He wasn't interested in showing the hardship that people were suffering there. So the two had a really fundamental view, and I think that fundamental view, that fundamental difference in views was what, again, was so interesting to her. This woman, so ahead of her time, versus so many of her peers who are willing to continue looking for work with Vanity Fair and taking portraits of wealthy people. Dorothea had had enough of that. She wanted to push people out of their comfort zone.
So we have an opportunity to ask questions. So raise your hand, and they're passing out sheets, and we'll ask those in a minute. So the art world was completely dominated by men during the prolific years of her career. And talk a little bit about how she was a trailblazer and how she navigated the complexities of a completely male-dominated art world.
Well, there are a few layers to this. I mean, first of all, the art scene in America, this was kind of a nascent art scene. I mean, really before World War II, all like important art was happening in Europe still. So the art community that existed in New York, which was kind of the center of Americans' art scene, all of those, again, sort of men, tended to have kind of chips on their shoulder that they were being sort of ignored out, in favor of art coming out of Europe. So then picture these artists who are on the West Coast, who are feeling left out of New York and Europe. I mean, so a lot of these artists on the West Coast felt sort of ignored, especially by Alt Stieglitz. They felt like they couldn't get his attention and kind of wider distribution of their work or recognition of their work. And so there was an element of that there's all these artists on the West were feeling a bit left out. And then there's photography, which in many ways people did not consider art. I mean, you were using a machine. You could do it in the snap of a finger. It wasn't like laboring over a canvas, a painting for months or years on end. And so while many fields over time kind of start, like I want to think about medicine here. Women for many centuries were great healers as midwives and healers. And it's really not until medical schools came into existence that women kind of get shut out, right? As things become institutionalized, often women are shut out. The same thing happened in the art world. So as the world of painting is becoming more of, art schools are developing, sure enough, women were left out of those for a long time. Then photography kind of crops up. It's not even really seen as art immediately. It actually offered up some pretty interesting opportunities for women because it hadn't been institutionalized in the way that so much of other art forms had been. So Dorothea was a part of a circle of a number of women who started off in this world of photography. Many of these women, as they married, they stopped producing photographs like overnight, literally. And in fact, one of the women who Dorothea eventually is on staff with for the FSA, she marries, of course, stops taking photos, and her husband even demanded that the FSA go back and relabel all of her photos with her new married name. So I mean, this was the world in which Dorothea was working. The fact that she continued producing creative work after being married was revolutionary in itself. And so I think she just continued on with this. I mean, she definitely went with the challenge. It's interesting when people today describe her as a feminist because Dorothea wasn't really separating herself out as a woman. She wanted to be a photographer who caught people's attention and pushed their comfort levels. She wasn't really at this point developing a community of other women. She was kind of developing just a community of other like-minded people. And I think that's important to recognize. I think if anything, she was an advocate for human rights in general. She was not really awake at this point in a world of feminism. It was about just social justice, attention to people who were being marginalized.
So she began to travel with Paul Taylor, who eventually became her second husband, and that was when she had her first exposure really to rural America. So can you share how her interactions with farmers and agriculture really shaped so much of her career during those years?
I know, it's so interesting that really Dorothea's most popular images are very agricultural, very rural in nature, because she was a city girl. She actually kind of made a joke at first when she met Paul Taylor and he invited her out on a road trip into Central California to document migrant conditions. She was like, I don't know a tractor from a mule. I mean, I don't know anything about this world. And yet, Paul was an economist, a professor at Berkeley, and he served as that college education for Dorothea in many ways. He was a New Dealer. He influenced her and educated her in really the plight of especially migrants pouring into California. And so Dorothea really embraced this. She was intrigued. She also saw the potential for her work to make a difference. Her photographs were able to sometimes galvanize rescue operations to come into these camps, bring food, bring new shelter, bring clothing, that kind of thing. Her photographs were used in Paul's reports that went to various government agencies that eventually led to more funding for more camps for these displaced people. So she was able to see her photographs resulting in people's lives being changed. And that was really important to her. She felt very passionate about that. And I think it gave her a sense of importance and self-worth that she had previously never really found anywhere else. Suddenly, she was a woman to be reckoned with. She was a woman with influence, and that was important to her.
So can you tell us a little bit about the whole interest in the Japanese internment camps and the photos that were impounded by the U.S. government, and Colonel Beasley, who is a fascinating character in the book. I'd highly recommend the book, by the way. It's a fascinating read. Anyway, it was an unusual subject and highly controversial. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, essentially the government hired her. I mean, she had had this kind of difficult relationship with her government employer all through her FSA years. She had had various miscommunications over her time from California to Washington, D.C., and she was fired periodically during this. She was given pink slips regularly for being difficult, for also just budget. I mean, budget was constantly in flux at this point, with the government really just struggling to kind of meet the needs as they saw of America's population that was really in need of support. And so Dorothea, at this point, her kind of work with the FSA is over. The government comes to her again and says, we want you to document the Japanese internment and this is always so puzzling to people, like, why were they documenting this? They wanted to show how peaceful it was, and that in many ways they believed they were doing a favor for society, and so this was a government record as far as they were concerned. Well, Dorothea really, and her husband Paul, were appalled. I mean, they knew what was starting to happen, and they thought everything about it was wrong. And so Dorothea agreed to do it so that she could take these photographs that she hoped would raise awareness. They didn't quite accomplish that because, yes, the government fired her again for taking subversive pictures. I mean, she was a real firebrand in many ways. She was always sort of pushing the rules the government gave her. No photos of guns, of barbed wire. They didn't want anything to look like jail, especially out of what was happening in Germany. They didn't want to show anything that looked like camps. And so Dorothea thought that that's exactly what it looked like. And in her photos, she did everything she could to show that. So then the government, yes, they impound her work. It kind of disappeared into the Library of Congress for many decades. And it sort of turns up about 60 years later in some very kind of shows with very limited circulation, university kind of shows. And then eventually, I think kind of as the Library of Congress was digitized, more and more the work sort of resurfaces. And it's really been probably in the last 15 years now that work is out and about more. And it is included in some of these retrospectives that have been traveling around of her work for the first time, really, since it was taken back in the early 40s. And this is where writing fiction is really fun and interesting. Because One thing I encountered when I was researching Manzanar is that when it eventually closed, the man who had been in charge of Manzanar, his next job was to go off and oversee a Native American reservation. I mean, I saw that and I'm like, that's a pretty messed up career track to be on, where that's your specialty. And yet my novel wasn't really going that far. But Dorothea, there was this Colonel Beasley who was very difficult in her work with the internment. She visits early in her arrival in California, shortly after her marriage to Maynard. She visits a Native American reservation and was pretty appalled by what she was seeing. At that point, she didn't really have the vocabulary. She really didn't know what to do with these feelings of like, oh my gosh, this is happening. This is happening on the government's watch, with the government's I mean, this is happening because of the government. She was really appalled by the whole thing, but didn't really know what she could do with that. I kind of looped in that Beasley. I mean, I wanted to show that connection, that thread that I think is really awful in our nation's history of that was a career path. So I kind of loop him in a little sooner. So he appears in that earlier reservation scene to show this connection. That's where writing historical fiction is really fun, to imagine connections or kind of change them a little bit to suit the storyline, to entertain, but at the same time educate. I think I have the best job out there, sorry.
She often, her photos for her were her narrative, and it was so frustrating to her because she tried to sell her photos to the newspapers and was routinely turned down.
Well, right. The FSA was really collecting all these photos, paying her to take photos that would eventually make it into newspapers. She wasn't ever directly selling her work, but she was trying to get her boss to get more images into the newspapers. And newspapers, you know, had their own agendas of what they wanted to represent, and it wasn't always Dorothea's. It wasn't quite as cutting edge as Dorothea's vision of what she wanted out there.
So in your research, where did she receive her photography training?
So it's really interesting. I'm always asked, like, how did Dorothea become a photographer? And this is sort of part of, I think, just what is so appealing about her. I mean, she's in New York at this point. She had some relatives who were kind of in creative fields as lithographers. And her grandmother from a very early age kind of told her she had an eye, that she was creative. And she never really let that go. She kind of held on to that. And she started working in a few portrait studios in New York, kind of as an administrative assistant, essentially. And by working at those places, she learned really what goes into running a portrait studio. She kind of learned how you find business. And she really kind of saw herself as like a woman. This opens up an interesting opportunity for me, because guess who is typically the main person who's arranging for family portraits and stuff? Yeah, it's the woman of the family, right? So Dorothea saw an opportunity for her to build relationships with other women. She saw that as a critical part of her business networking. And so she just kind of, she had this ability. She was actually not a great student. As a high schooler, she regularly cut class and would go kind of wander the streets of New York. And her interest was kind of watching people and just seeing how different people were living. She was very intrigued by kind of just seeing people. And this translated into her picking up a camera and again, turning her lens onto people. She was forever interested in people. Although the nature of those portraits of people changed, it was people that were the heart and soul of her work, absolutely.
So here's an interesting question. Was there a discussion at the time of the differences between her photographs and those of Ansel Adams, for example, of Manzanar?
Well, not really, because her work was never really seen by the public at this point. I mean, yeah, it was impounded. So no. I mean, the public of images that were being seen, they were the government-approved images by Ansel Adams, Clem Albers, some other men of that time period.
So you mentioned her children earlier and that her husband was not going to care for them. Who did? Did she bring her children with her on her photographic trips?
Oh, boy. Well, so this is sort of something that is a key part of the novel, is the choices she has to make as a mom. And eventually what she ends up feeling is her best choice was to foster out her two children. And again, this is something as modern readers that is amazing to us. And yet this was the choice, this was the best choice Dorothea felt she had at that point. And it left behind a lifetime of very complicated feelings with her children. I mean, this is really, you know, the accomplishments she had as a professional photographer came at a very steep price in her personal life, absolutely. And I think she regretted them for much of her life. She never apologized for those choices she made, but they never really sat well with her too, is from everything I read about her, is the impression I got.
You made a point of saying that in her photos, the subjects are often looking into the camera, but her most famous photo, the one on the stamp,
Right.
has the subject looking a bit off to the left. Was that choreographed, or did someone pick which photo to use, or do you know anything about that very famous photo?
Right. So actually, Dorothea was interested in people not looking right into the camera. She did want people to. She wanted to often show that people had a rich interior life. So she was totally fine. She didn't want people to sit perfectly and tilt their head and smile, like your school photos of today. She wanted kind of a more introspective look by her subjects. As for Migrant Mother, that is a photo, I mean, that was a photo that by all accounts, she took under very hurried circumstances. She was on her way north from Southern California, past this handwritten sign for this pea pickers camp by Nipomo, California, and kept driving for a little bit, and that sign was sticking with her. It was pouring rain, kind of like what we had earlier here today. It just was niggling away at her, and so she turns around and she dashes off pretty quick photos, is how she always described it, of this camp. She takes the wide shot, she takes closer-up shots. She did ask for people to turn a little bit with the light and stuff, but really hastily taken photographs. She was always sort of amazed in many ways that this was her most famous photograph, because it didn't feel super momentous at the moment in which she took it. She came racing back, had it developed quickly, and had it to a newspaper editor by that evening. And actually, that is a photograph that resulted in pretty quick turnaround of rescue being made to that camp, because waters were rising. I mean, it was pouring rain. Dorothea had been worried about flooding, and so help was brought to that camp really as a result of that photo. But Dorothea took thousands of photos just like it, of just really heartrending people who are struggling to, again, fill that American dream. That, you know, some of her work immediately surfaced in some of John Steinbeck's series he did, The Harvest Gypsies, some of his earliest work that The Grapes of Wrath is based on. And Dorothea, her photos were often accompanied those articles he wrote. And she had a kind of a complicated relationship with him. They were a bit kind of frenemies, really not so much friends though even. It was, her work was often paired with his. She actually at one point asked him to write a foreword for a book she was working on, and he never did it for her. Interesting.
So her bout with polio that resulted in her somewhat withered
Yes.
right foot and leg and her limp, and during her life she kind of regards it as both a blessing and a curse.
Right.
And so talk about how that disability shaped not only her relationships, but her career, her view of the world. I know you talked about it earlier, but it's a thread that is throughout the entire book.
It is. I mean, I think it's something she really struggled to make peace with over her entire life. She did see it eventually as bringing, as having shaped her into being an empathetic person, of someone who was interested in looking at things that maybe scared people, made other people feel uncomfortable. She knew what it was like to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, and so that definitely inspired much of her work. It's interesting, a photo, she eventually taught photography, and she would often do the assignments she would give her students. And she did one that she said, take a photograph of home. And she said that kind of knowing that a lot of kids would take her photograph very literally and like go document wherever they were living. But that was a photo that when she thought about it over, you know, the course of time of which she wanted to complete the assignment along with her students, she ended up photographing her foot. without anything on it, just her bare foot, because she realized that that was home. And that is something I work into the novel, because I think it really shows that arc that I was so interested in, this character development of a woman who is trying to find her place in the world for so long, trying to make peace with some things that brought her pain for much of her life. And that is something that I think she did eventually see as having brought her certain gifts. Again, it came at a steep cost, though.
There's an interesting piece of the book where she and Frida Kahlo were both married to very difficult,
a lot of similarities,
brilliant men, and they kind of have a moment where they kind of connect with being married to these very volatile and philandering men.
Right. Well, also, and Frida had polio. I mean, they physically had a great deal in common. Dorothea recommended her physician, actually, for Frida. And Frida maintained a relationship with that physician for the rest of her life. And in fact, the hospital where he had worked has a bunch of Frida Kahlo paintings that she made him. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So Dorothea and Frida did find a lot in common. I mean, they found some real commune together in some of the experiences that had shaped both of them.
There was an exhibit of Dorothea's work at the Oakland Museum in 2017, and Elise told us at dinner that it's now in Paris.
It is, yes. It may have just ended in Paris, actually. I don't know where it is right now, but yes, that is work that has been making its way. Yeah, did you see it in Paris?
Oh, no.
Yeah, cool.
Any other last questions before we? Yes.
Who is the Dorothea now who's photographing what's happening at our border with the children being taken from?
You know, I mean, okay. This novel is something I started in 2015. And I was interested in that transformation in her activism. I had no idea how relevant this would become again. I mean, and I would have written a different, you know, it's been heartbreaking to see. I think we need more Dorotheas out there right now. I think what maybe seems to be a difference is that there is a lot more public indignation about what is happening now, yet still it is occurring. Families are being broken up. I mean, nothing good comes out of breaking up families. This novel shows us that. I mean, Dorothea's story tells us that. Nothing good comes from it. And so it is, you know, I think maybe the government may have learned maybe not to document so closely with photographs what is happening. I mean, we know there are activists trying to take pictures and journalists trying to get in these camps and being turned away. I don't know. I am right there with you. I have been astounded by how history is repeating itself in a lot of ways. Or if it's not repeating itself exactly, it's sure sounding the same. It's sounding very similar, right? This novel was bought by my publisher right after, like several days after the presidential election of 2016. And the novel in a lot of ways sort of changed. I mean, suddenly that Dorothea's activism became more interesting to me than ever and really so relevant. Like when I was at the Women's March in Seattle, I looked around and I think Dorothea would have been pretty into that. She would have been, I think, very inspired to see public outcry and indignation toward people being marginalized. We need more Dorotheas for sure. And it's interesting because we all have the power to be Dorothea because really all of us in our pocket right now have those cameras. So yeah, I hear you. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
Back here, yes?
Since you did so much research on her, why did you fictionalize the story? Why didn't you just do a biography?
Yes. So the question, and I'm so glad you asked this. This is asked me all the time. Why didn't I write another biography on Dorothea Lange? First of all, there's some really good ones already out there. And specifically, I really found Linda Gordon's to be very compelling, and I emailed her some questions and she got back to me, and it's a great biography. I felt like that was done very well. I didn't feel the need to repeat that. I also, and typically when I approach a project, I'm very interested in sort of a question, a moment, and for me it was very much this transformation from sort of like commercial businesswoman to then sort of activist artist. And so I did not want to focus on her entire life, which her life, I mean, not beyond just the scope of my novel, has so many interesting aspects to it. But I had that sort of few decades that really interested me. So that's why I chose to do that. I think that novels are often really accessible to people. Again, I sort of talk about how I love to trick people into learning, and I think historical fiction is a great vehicle for that. So there wasn't a novel out there about really Dorothea Lange's life. Mary Coyne is a novel that's also based on Dorothea's life, and that is a really interesting one. It's different from what I did. So I felt there was space out there for a novel. But I did think the biographies, that space has been very well done. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, how do you change it, though, if you're writing about Dorothea? Because I haven't read the book.
Sure.
So how do you change it from bio to fiction? And
Right.
still using the same character?
Yes. So the question there is, how do I, if I'm basing fiction on a real person, like how do I make those changes? Right? Did I just do your question justice? Okay. So again, that's where I have to be pretty focused on the journey I'm looking for my character. And I'll give you an example. Dorothea, kind of late in my novel, there's a moment, and there's sort of this moment in her life where she has to make kind of a hard choice about turning away from her professional career to deal with some family issues. In real life, her brother was also having a bunch of some legal problems that she needed to help him with. I did not include that in my novel because it felt to me like that's traveling a lot of different paths. I was kind of interested in that arc of her own like making peace with her own family, or trying to. And so the brother didn't really fit into that. Her boys certainly did to me. That was really interesting to me. I was very interested in that issue of motherhood and ambition. So it's just where I have to, as a novelist, try to be really disciplined about the emotional journey of my character. Because it's historical fiction, I can sort of choose to do that. I will say that I really believe you can Grab a Hunk of Lightning, you can read a biography of hers, and not read my novel and feel like I made any serious changes to the story. I mean, I really did not change any major outcomes. So I think that it can coexist in this sort of world of interest in Dorothea Lange with already existing work that's out there. But again, yeah, I just have to kind of do what is sort of, I'm seeing the journey. It's kind of it's a little bit of a mystical business in some ways, of like communing with these characters that are sort of my own. It gets a little woo-woo, I guess. What's in my own head. Thank you.
Okay, the question is, in doing your research,
Yes.
I'm going to assume that you read all of the existing biographies
Yes.
that have been done about Dorothea. But I'd like to know two questions.
Okay.
What was the most valuable interview or
Right.
meeting that you
Yeah.
had in doing your research with someone who was alive during the period that you were doing that? And then if you could have just a magic wish, you could go back in time, other than Dorothea herself, I'm going to assume you'd like to have interviewed her, but who would you have wanted to talk to who was inside of Dorothea's life,
Right.
who you weren't able to come up with a feeling for her life?
Okay, this is such a good question. And I'll repeat it. And I want you to check in with me again that I've got it all. All right, so the question is, with all this research I did, number one, what was kind of my most valuable resource?
Well, I assume that you read all of
Yep.
the existing work.
Yep,
A lot of us probably have read some of those books.
right. So what was my important?
Beyond reading, who did you talk to? Who did
Oh.
you meet who is alive now,
Okay.
who was part of Dorothea's life, that gave you insight
Okay.
and perspective or an experience? And then if you could have had just a wish, who would you like to have spoken to who, because they weren't alive,
Okay.
you were not able to, other than Dorothea? I'm assuming you would like to have interviewed
Sure.
her.
Yeah.
But who in her life do you think would have given you the real insight into
Okay.
who she was?
All right, so the question then is, sorry, what source was then the most important for informing my vision of Dorothea, number one? And number two, who would I go back, if I could conjure up someone from the past to bring back to talk to, but I'm not allowed to talk to Dorothea.
Because they're not here. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the first part of that is, I did read all the biographies. I found that Grab a Hunk of Lightning, the documentary done on her, American Master, to be fascinating. And Dorothea's own voice is in there. She is interviewed. I thought that was an amazing source. I also really spent a lot of time on Dorothea, the oral history she did with the University of California. That was a really important source for me. I did not interview any of her descendants. Many of them have produced creative work of their own, and by the work they had put out into the public sphere already, that was what I worked with. I didn't want to have to interrupt anyone's private lives to, I felt like if people had something to say about her, they had put it out there through books, through articles, through interviews maybe they had done, or documentary work. So I used the work that was out there, all of what was in many ways very close to her. So those were the sources that were sort of the most important to me, along with her photographs. I mean, those were a huge source of informing me of kind of what she considered important and things. And then if I could go back and talk to someone, I mean, honestly, it would have been Dan Dixon. I was really fascinated by the sort of heartbreaking nature, I think, of that relationship, for sure. Dan was her oldest son, who he never really forgave her for the choices that she had made, in a way that he did not seem to kind of hold against Maynard. Dorothea seemed to hold a special pain for him, and so I've seen the Children of Giants, the documentary that where the boys are interviewed. But yeah, I would absolutely be interested in his side. I mean, he would produce a whole other narrative of what had happened that would be fascinating.
Can I offer something up that
Yes.
I would love to have been able to be part of? The conversations that she had as she was driving across the country, working for the project with Ron Partridge.
Yeah, that's
She
a
hired
great,
him as a young man. What conversations
Absolutely,
he must have had with
I
her
know.
as he was driving her across the country, and she's just, going off.
Right.
That would be
That's a
book in and
great
of itself.
idea. So Ron Partridge was Imogen's son, and Dorothea hires him eventually to be her assistant. And this is partly also because labor relations were getting quite antagonistic in parts of California. Dorothea's boss at the FSA wanted her to have some protection. It wanted her to have kind of a strong man there with her in case things got dicey. And so Dorothea hired Imogen's son, and they did have a really fascinating relationship.
50,000 miles.
Yeah, where they traveled much of the country together. And so, yeah, I hadn't really even thought of him, but I did find their relationship while I was doing not to be really interesting. That's a great idea. You can write that novel. Send me a copy when it's done.
So if this has not piqued your curiosity to read this fascinating book, I don't know what would. So please join me in thanking Elise Hooper, and she's going to be signing this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.